Good evening. At this time, I'd like to call to order the Planning Commission meeting of September 26, 2022. For viewers watching at home, some members of the public may be participating via video conference or teleconference. This time, I'd like to ask that we all stand and please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Will the Secretary please call the roll?
Commissioner Buss?
Present.
Commissioner Lanson?
Here.
Commissioner Link?
Present.
Commissioner McMahon? Here. Chair Newman?
Here. We move on to written comments, announcements, supplemental packet, and continuances. Tonight, we have with us Deputy Community Director John Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have one supplemental packet which has a little bit of written correspondence.
Thank you. Moving on to public comments. At this time, any person may address the Commission regarding a city planning matter that is not on this evening's agenda. Should the Commission wish to discuss an issue raised by a member of the public, The issue will be referred to staff for scheduling on a future agenda. Anyone who would like to speak under public comments must fill out a speaker card in chambers or click Request to Speak on the agenda to receive instructions before the public comments portion of the agenda is called. The speaker's remarks should be addressed to the commission as a whole and not to any individual commissioner or staff member. Unless otherwise provided by the commission, speakers are limited to 5 minutes. The screen will show you the remaining time you have. Do we have any public comments this evening?
No.
Thank you. From now on, I'm going to ask that question first. Moving on to our consent calendar. We have a consent calendar with the minutes of our September 12th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. Are there any comments, or do commissioners have comments or a motion to approve the minutes?
Move to approve the minutes.
Mr. Chairman, we have a comment there from our secretary.
Madam Secretary.
Yes, there's a small change to page 1. Commissioner Link and Chair Newman should only appear as abstaining, and that's 3-0 for the August 29th minutes.
So
Move to approve with
Commissioner
that.
Link, your motion is to approve as amended.
As amended, correct.
Any discussion? Will the clerk please prepare us for a vote?
Commissioner Buss?
Aye.
Commissioner Lanson?
Aye.
Commissioner Link?
Yes.
Commissioner McMahon? Yes. Chair Newman?
Aye. We move now to our public hearings, our one and only hearing tonight. Well, we'll have the clerk open the hearing.
And the consent calendar passed 5-0.
Thank you.
Item 7A, a hearing having been advertised as required by law is hereby open to consider Agenda Item 7A, Municipal Code Amendment MCA 2022-70465, to adopt a resolution recommending that the City Council introduce an ordinance amending the Thousand Oaks Municipal Code by adding Article 37 to Title 9, Chapter 4, modifying Sections 9-4.202 and 9-4.2202, and adding Section 9-3.305 to Title 9, Chapter 3, Article 3, to update the city's zoning regulations to implement 2021 Senate Bill Number 9, SB 9, including the addition of a ministerial process for the approval of urban lot splits and 2-unit housing developments, and to determine that the ordinance is exempt from CEQA. It's located citywide, and the applicant is the City of Thousand Oaks.
Thank you. Presenting for staff this evening is Associate Planner Justine Kendall, and available for questions are Mr. Dugan, as well as Assistant City Attorney Noel Duran and Interim Planning Manager Ian Holt. Ms. Kendall, good evening.
Good evening, Chair, members of the Planning Commission, and public. As just stated, the request before you this evening is to find that this municipal code amendment is exempt from the provisions of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, pursuant to California Government Code sections 65852.21J and 66411.7N, and to adopt a resolution recommending that City Council introduce an ordinance amending the municipal code by adding Article 37 to Title 9, Chapter 4, and modifying sections 9-4.202, or the definition section, and 9-4.2202, the objective standards section, and adding section 9-3.305 to Title 9, Chapter 3, Article 3, to update the city's zoning regulations to implement 2021 Senate Bill Number 9, known as SB 9, including the addition of a ministerial process for the approval of urban lot splits and 2-unit housing developments, and to determine the ordinance to be exempt from CEQA. On May 24th, 2022, City Council approved a resolution initiating this request, which brings us to the hearing tonight, in which the Planning Commission is to review the proposed ordinance, hold the public hearing, and make a recommendation back to the City Council on the adoption, denial, or alteration of the proposed amendments. City Council will then review and hold a public hearing prior to taking final action, and that meeting is scheduled to take place in about 2 weeks on October 11th. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on the state law that we're implementing. Senate Bill 9, again also known as SB 9, is also known as the California Home Act and was part of the Senate's Building Opportunities for All housing package created to address the severe housing shortage in California. SB 9 was signed by Governor Newsom on September 16, 2021, and went into effect on January 1, 2022. At the most basic level, SB 9 allows owners of a property within a single-family residential zone to 1, build 2 primary residential units per lot, and 2, to subdivide a lot into 2 parcels, with the end goal of allowing a possible maximum of 4 dwelling units within the original single-family lot boundaries. And I'll go ahead and note here that since the law went into effect and the city therefore began accepting applications, there have been approximately 30 inquiries into the city's SB 9 implementation and application process, and as of today, only 1 complete application has been received. In addition to laying out the type of development now allowed, the law also describes the eligibility criteria, process, and level of review allowed, and how jurisdictions may regulate SB 9 projects through objective standards, both state mandated and potentially implemented by a local jurisdiction. I'll go over each of these areas that you see here in more detail, but for a quick overview, again, the development allowed is a one-time subdivision of an existing single-family residential parcel into 2 parcels, what we're calling an urban lot split, and 2 homes on an eligible single-family residential parcel, not including permissible accessory dwelling units. This is a project type that we're calling 2-unit housing development. ADUs and junior ADUs are allowed to be developed in conjunction with an SB 9 project, but would be processed separately under applicable state and local ADU law, and I will talk more about that later. To be eligible to propose either of those project types, a property must be designated as within a single-family residential zone, with several key exceptions including, but not limited to, properties within prohibited areas like historic properties or protected habitat areas, projects that require the demolition or alteration of certain types of rental or affordable units, and environmental hazard areas if adherence to required additional standards are not possible. Sorry, I lost my place for a second. If eligible, SB 9 specifically states that all SB 9 projects must be reviewed ministerially. Jurisdictions can conduct objective design review, but may not apply subjective or other discretionary approval processes, and may not have hearings for projects that meet the state rules. There are application requirements, such as a recorded document acknowledging occupancy and tenancy restrictions, which are mandated as well. And finally, the law outlines how jurisdictions, such as the city, may regulate SB 9 projects. Jurisdictions may only apply objective zoning subdivision and design standards to SB 9 related projects. And these standards, importantly, may not preclude the construction of up to 2 units of at least 800 square feet each. And I'll repeat that quite often. This law is similar to recent state ADU legislation in that it allows jurisdictions to apply local standards as long as they do not prevent that minimum level of development. And I will go into what standards are mandated and where the city has some flexibility when we talk in more detail about these. So now I'll dive into more detail on each of those kind of 4 main areas. And quick reminder, again, the law requires ministerial approval of an urban lot split or a one-time subdivision. of an existing single-family residential parcel into two, and a 2-unit housing development, which is 2 homes on an eligible single-family residential parcel, not including permissible ADUs. That development can be accomplished in a few different ways, as you can see in this graphic. In scenario A, which is circled here, in which a lot is not being subdivided, homeowners can use SB 9 to build 2 new homes on a vacant lot, plus whatever ADUs and JADUs would be allowed on site. In no event more than 2, for a total of 4 residential units. If there is an existing home, they can add 1 new dwelling unit plus whatever ADUs and JDUs would be allowed on site, and in any event, no more than 2, for, again, a total of 4 residential units. If an existing residence and an ADU or a JADU already exist on site, 1 new dwelling unit plus only 1 additional ADU or JADU could be added. In scenario B, where a lot is being subdivided, homeowners can split that lot to build 2 new units on each of the 2 new lots, allowing for a total of 4 units within the original property boundaries. If there are existing units on the lot, 2 new homes can be added, also resulting in a total of 4 potential units. In all cases, 4 units is the maximum, inclusive of ADUs and JADUs. 4 units are the maximum, inclusive of ADUs and JADUs. This is important, so I'm going to repeat it again a couple more times. These units can be detached, attached, or conversions of existing structures. To show it another way, prior to the passage of SB 9, a single-family residential zone property allowed for a total of 3 housing units, 1 primary dwelling unit, the main house, 1 ADU, and 1 junior accessory dwelling unit, a JADU. Now, under current law, with the implementation of SB 9, without an urban lot split, which is the middle column that you see here, a lot with a single-family home can add an additional primary dwelling unit plus a junior or regular ADU per primary or main unit. If you have a vacant lot, you can build 2 primary dwelling units plus a junior or regular ADU each. These homes are subject to objective standards as long as those standards do not preclude 2 800 square foot units on each property. And if you do use an urban lot split, or if you propose this development with an urban lot split, a homeowner can build 2 homes on each of the 2 new lots, allowing for a total of 4 units. No more than 2 homes may be on each lot. If there are existing units, new homes can be added, again, to result in a maximum of 4 potential units. A jurisdiction may choose to allow more than 4 per SB 9 if they choose. Okay, moving on to eligibility, again in more detail. SB 9 applies to all single-family residential zones in urbanized jurisdictions, which City of Thousand Oaks is. These are zones in which residential uses are limited to 1 single-family dwelling per lot, and uses typically associated with single-family zones are permitted. No multiple family uses or other commercial uses are allowed in those zones. In Thousand Oaks, this includes the R1, RA, RE, RO residential districts, and those hillside plan development and residential plan development zones in which the predominant existing development is single-family residential. However, SB 9 specifically prohibits urban lot splits and 2-unit housing development projects in historic areas, which is not applicable in the city, or environmentally sensitive areas such as wetlands, conservation areas, and protected species habitat areas. Wetlands are not generally present in single-family zoned areas in the city, and there are few, if any, conservation easement areas. But as I'll discuss later on, affirmative documentation that no protected habitat area will be disturbed is suggested to be required as part of the application process. In addition, SB 9 projects may not take place within hazardous areas such as FEMA-designated flood zones, hazardous waste sites, earthquake fault zones, or very high fire hazard severity zones without complying with the additional requirements and standards normally applied by the city within those zones. In addition, there are limitations related to demolition. Projects involving the demolition or alteration of any dwellings that are income restricted to levels affordable to persons of families and families of moderate, low, or very low income, that are subject to rent control imposed by a public entity, or that have been occupied by a rental tenant within the last 3 years are prohibited. There are also eligibility requirements for urban lot splits projects only, including one use, that only one lot split is allowed per lot. However, further splits may be possible under regular subdivision procedures if the lot size and dimensions allow. And SB 9 prohibits lot splits where the owner or any person acting in concert with the owner has previously subdivided an adjacent parcel using an urban lot split process. Since SB 9 does not specifically define acting in concert, the ordinance has, as drafted, includes the definition that you see here to clarify what acting in concert means. Compliance with the eligibility requirements, both general and lot split only, will generally be determined through application requirements, such as a written statement, again affirming that there is no habitat for protected species within the vicinity of the project property. Project review, such as the review of city and other agency GIS platforms, and a deed restriction to be recorded prior to occupancy, which includes a statement by the owner that their property is compliant with all of these requirements. If a property and project are found to be eligible under all those requirements, applications will need to be submitted and reviewed under a process determined by state and local regulation. Jurisdictions, including the city, must review and process applications for 2-unit housing developments and urban lot splits ministerially. Ministerially means projects must be approved without any public hearing or subjective judgment from city staff if it meets state and local law requirements, and the subject, including the subject ordinance implementing objective standards. Ministerial approvals typically do not include any public noticing requirements, as there is no ability to appeal or request administrative review. However, as SB 9 does not explicitly remove an HOA's authority to prohibit this type of development, as the ADU law did, the ordinance has been drafted to state that if the site is associated with a homeowners association, an HOA, the applicant must provide proof that they have at least notified the HOA of their proposed project. SB 9 does also specifically exempt eligible projects from CEQA review. And it's important to note, too, that all SB 9 projects will still be reviewed by all the various city departments, community development, public works, et cetera, to ensure compliance with applicable municipal code standards and technical codes, such as the building code and the fire code. In addition, SB 9 housing development projects are subject to the Permit Streamlining Act, meaning that review for completeness must take place within 30 days and approval within 60 days of receiving a complete application. Lot split applications are not subject to permit streamlining, and the review time is expected to take approximately the same amount of time as it would under the process normally used to divide a single property. Lastly, unlike, again, state ADU law, SB 9 does not exempt the development of these units from any applicable city fees, such as traffic and Quimby impact fees, utility connection fees, and school fees. All fees which would normally apply still apply. In addition to all necessary plans and exhibits, the application for either type of SB 9 project, the urban lot split or 2-unit housing development, will require a biologist statement of no protected habitat, to determine eligibility, as well as a protected tree report or statement that there are no protected trees in the vicinity of the project area, a title report, and proof that the HOA has been notified if applicable. Recorded affidavits are required for all SB9 projects to ensure compliance with the eligibility requirements and to acknowledge that short-term rentals are not permitted. As required by SB9, if an applicant proposes an urban lot split, that subdivider must also record an affidavit stating that they intend to occupy one of the housing units for a minimum of 3 years from the date of approval. In order to meet that requirement, a habitable dwelling unit must exist on the property by the time the new parcel map is approved. To ensure a residence exists at that time, and to encourage projects to meet the intent of the law, which is to increase the supply of housing, the ordinance as currently drafted recommends or states that an urban lot split application should not be accepted except in conjunction with a concurrently submitted application for residential development on the newly created parcel, if the property has an existing residence, or on both parcels if both resulting properties are vacant, unless a 2-unit housing development project has previously been approved on the subject property already. The applications will be reviewed simultaneously, and the approval of the new parcel map would be held until the building permits are issued. So if you want to apply for one or both types of SB9 projects and your property is eligible, what standards do you need to meet while designing your project? SB9 details methods jurisdictions may use to regulate SB9 proposals. There are some actions jurisdictions must take, some decisions jurisdictions can choose to take, and some topics that they may not regulate at all. Importantly, jurisdictions may only impose objective zoning, design, and subdivision standards. Standards may not physically preclude the construction of 2 units or less than 800 square feet each per property. The city's subdivision and zoning ordinances currently contain a number of objective standards that would continue to apply to SB9 projects. And as you may remember, the city also recently adopted a set of objective design standards contained within Article 22 now of the zoning code. And those apply usually to the development of housing projects of 2 units or more. However, the ordinance is drafted to state that this Article 22 should not apply to SB9 developments, as those standards really were not tailored for this type of small-scale infill development. Instead, the proposed ordinance before you tonight has compiled applicable objective subdivision zoning and design standards specifically for SB9 subdivision and housing development projects, which we're going to get into in just a second. The specific state standards mandated by SB9 include the list that you see here. Required yards, meaning that jurisdictions may not impose residential setbacks greater than 4 feet for side and rear property lines. The city may specify front yard standards. The city must require that or must allow any setbacks requirements for a unit that is currently existing to remain. So if a unit is converted within an existing living area or in the same location and to the same dimensions as the existing structure, those setbacks must be allowed to remain. Jurisdictions may not require more than 1 parking space per unit. Staff has recommended requiring that space be enclosed, as we'll get into. The law also states that a number of different exemptions, but to allow no parking to be required, but none of those apply within the city. In addition, jurisdictions may not reject an application because it proposes adjacent or connected structures, provided that the structures meet building safety code standards. And again, as with existing city and state regulations for ADUs and JADUs, SB9 prohibits rental tenancies of less than 31 days in any SB9 unit. The following additional limitations apply to all urban lot split projects under SB 9. That the primary uses on the resulting lots are limited to residential uses only. The subdivider must sign that affidavit stating that they intend to occupy one of the units for a minimum of 3 years. Jurisdictions may not require correction of an existing legal nonconforming condition as a condition for ministerial approval. The draft does require or include, however, language clarifying that the proposed projects may not exacerbate an existing legal nonconformity. Jurisdictions may not require dedications of rights-of-way or the construction of off-site improvements. They may, however, require easements that are required for the provision of public services and facilities. And no parcel shall be less than 1,200 square feet, and the smallest parcel must be at least 40% of the original lot size. And jurisdictions may, by this ordinance, adopt a smaller minimum lot size if they choose, per SB 9. While SB 9 does require applicants and cities to comply with those certain provisions, it also provides cities and jurisdictions with some flexibility and allows them to implement objective standards so long as they, again, do not preclude 2 units of at least 800 square feet each. The list here describes areas of flexibility allowed by SB 9 where those possible objective standards could be imposed by the city. And I'll go through each of these now, describing what is in the ordinance as drafted and touching on what flexibility is allowed per SB 9. These standards may be revised per the recommendation of the Planning Commission or direction of City Council, provided that they comply with the requirements of SB 9. The standards in the ordinance were drafted to maintain as much consistency with the required design and development normally required for single-family residential development as possible. When a lot split occurs, the local agency must allow up to 2 units on each lot resulting from the lot split. In this situation, all 3 unit types, a primary unit, an ADU, and a junior ADU, count toward this 2-unit limit. For example, the limit could be reached on each lot by creating 2 primary units, or a primary unit and an ADU, or a primary unit and a junior ADU. By building 2 units on each lot, the overall maximum of 4 units required under SB 9 is achieved. Again, the city may choose to allow more than 2 units per lot if desired. When a lot split has not occurred, the lot is eligible to build 2 primary units as well as 1 ADU or junior ADU per primary unit, as it ordinarily would under ADU law. In terms of maximum unit size, under the proposed ordinance, the size of a unit would be controlled by the required setbacks, the percentage of usable open space on the lot, property characteristics, limitations on grading, existing development, and costs, and the standards that we'll review in this presentation. A maximum floor area standard is not included in the existing municipal code standard, or in the standards that are currently existing for single-family residential development. And so to maintain that consistency, that has not been recommended in the draft ordinance. However, if desired, SB 9 does allow the city to set the maximum floor area standards, but they may not be any lower than that 800 square feet for 2 units each. Pursuant to SB 9, if a dwelling unit on the site has been rented in the past 3 years, no demolition of that unit which has been rented is allowed. If there are other units on the same site, demolition of up to 25% of the existing exterior walls of the non-rental unit is allowed per SB 9, unless the city allows for more via this ordinance. If no dwelling unit on the site has been rented in the last 3 years, the entire structure may be demolished. To provide some clarity for applicants in the future, staff has included a definition for demolition in the proposed ordinance. The city may adopt regulations which allow for greater than 25% demolition of the existing unit that has not been rented but are on the same site as a rental unit. However, staff has not included any such provision in the proposed ordinance. A flag lot is a lot behind another lot with a long segment extending along one side of the front lot to connect the rear to the street, as you can see in the middle diagram on this slide. Typically, the extension is only as wide as a driveway, which gives the resulting lot the appearance of a flag on a flagpole. Since the purpose of the extension is to connect the rear lot to the street for vehicular access, the base of the pole usually has a curb cut and an apron built into the public right-of-way. In situations where land allows, an urban lot split, including a flag lot, would likely result in 2 driveways with curb cuts where previously there was only 1. Each new curb cut removes at least 1 street parking space available to the neighborhood on streets that allow parking. And so the ordinance as drafted states that flag lots are prohibited in favor of requiring subdividers to create an access easement over the front property's driveway for the rear property to access the street, which is the rightmost diagram that you see here. Landlocked parcels created by an urban lot split must therefore have an access easement, as you can see here on again, that third diagram, over the other parcel on the same map and must connect to the same curb cut and apron as the other parcel on the map in order to preserve street parking. The easement must also meet the access requirements of the city engineer and the Ventura County Fire Department. SB 9 does not specifically prohibit the implementation of other objective standards related to lot configuration, and so those may be added. Except as required by the building code, existing setbacks may be maintained for SB 9 units built within an existing structure, conversion, or built in the same location and within the same dimensions as an existing structure. Setback requirements are also waived for subdivisions where the new property line is adjacent to an existing structure. For all other SB 9 units, the city may only require side and rear yard setbacks of no more than 4 feet. Normally, side setbacks range from 0 to 15 feet, and rear setbacks are usually between 10 and 20 feet. As noted previously, SB 9 does not prescribe a front yard setback requirement, so the ordinance is drafted to say that existing front yard setbacks of the underlying zoning district, which is typically 20 feet, must continue to apply for parcels fronting a street. However, for landlocked parcels or lots that have no direct access to a street except by an easement over another lot, the draft ordinance states that all setbacks shall be a minimum of 4 feet, as it's often impractical and it's subjective to determine which property line is the front. And as you can see in this diagram, selecting the front yard may be somewhat arbitrary in some cases and artificially push a development towards one house or another by prescribing a front lot standard. In addition to the required setbacks, a minimum amount of usable open space is currently required by both the city's new objective standards and residential plan development, or RPD, permits. To remain consistent with existing single-family residential standards, the ordinance has included that at least 15% of each lot with an SB 9 unit is designated as usable open space as defined in the ordinance. As it relates to required yards, the city may choose a different front yard setback minimum or suggest a different minimum usable open space requirement or remove that requirement, or create additional incentives for certain types of development or implement setback requirements, for example, for second and third stories. In almost all cases, the city's existing regulations limit the height of single-family dwellings to 25 feet unless increased side yard setbacks are provided. ADUs and JADUs are typically held to the same height limit as the primary dwelling unit, except when detached, in which case they are limited to 16 feet. Accordingly, the ordinance states that a 25-foot height limit is the maximum, or up to 35 feet with increased side and rear yard setbacks for SB 9 units to remain consistent with the majority of existing single-family residence standards. Detached ADUs would continue to be regulated by ADU-specific law and still only be allowed to be 16 feet. As the state is silent on this standard, the city may increase or decrease the maximum height allowed, as opposed to what is in the ordinance as drafted. The city's existing regulations require 2 enclosed off-street parking spaces for each single-family dwelling with 4 bedrooms or less, 3 spaces or 2 enclosed for those with 5 or 6 bedrooms, and 3 enclosed spaces for those with 7 bedrooms or more. However, SB 9 limits this requirement to only 1 parking space per unit and none at all if located within 1/2 mile of walking distance of a high-quality transit corridor or within 1 block of a car share vehicle. There are currently no bus routes in Thousand Oaks operating at a level which would qualify it as a high-quality transit corridor. But neither SB 9 nor previously adopted state ADU law, which includes similar parking exemptions, defines a car share vehicle. As such, the ordinance does include a definition for that. Unlike ADU law, there is also no reduction of the parking requirement for garage conversion projects. Staff recommends that 1 enclosed off-street parking space be required for each SB 9 unit unless the garage structure would physically preclude the SB 9 units from being at least 800 square feet in floor area, in which case the required parking may be unenclosed. The city could choose to allow the spaces to be unenclosed instead. The city's existing regulations require a design review for new single-family dwellings and additional on-site development. This is a discretionary process using subjective design guidelines with final approval typically granted either by staff or the Planning Commission if a project is required to be heard at a public hearing. The city may not impose the same discretionary and subjective process for SB 9 projects. As currently drafted, the ordinance requires facade requirements for garage conversions to avoid flat blank walls facing the street, which can occur in some cases. Each primary dwelling unit should also include a minimum of 160 cubic feet of enclosed storage area, as storage areas are often the spaces which are converted. And additionally, the ordinance states that all SB 9 units address privacy concerns by prohibiting any window or door of a dwelling unit within 10 feet of an adjoining residential property without the use of privacy glass. The city's existing regulations require discretionary review and a public hearing for new development on hillside lots within the HPD zone. To remain consistent but maintain a ministerial process, staff recommends that the objective grading limitations currently contained within the municipal code apply to all SB 9 units located on lots designated as being within the HPD zone. Similarly, projects proposed on properties that are located within the protected ridgeline overlay zone are subject to the objective standards contained within the municipal code section related to protected ridgeline overlay zone regulations. Those objective standards have been referenced and incorporated into the subject ordinance. The city's existing standards similarly require discretionary review and a public hearing for any grading or relocation of earth on land having a natural slope greater than 25%. This review and approval process is discretionary and subjective and therefore cannot apply to subdivisions or the construction of new dwellings pursuant to SB 9. As such, staff recommends that no SB 9 project shall be allowed which requires grading on a natural slope greater than 25% unless that restriction would physically preclude the development of at least 2 800 square foot primary dwelling units. The city's existing regulations do not require owner occupancy for dwellings other than JADUs, in which case owner occupancy of the house or JDU is required by state law. SB 9 prohibits the city from requiring owner occupancy as a condition of an SB 9 urban lot split, but applicants choosing to pursue an urban lot split are required, again, to declare that they will occupy a dwelling unit on the property for 3 years following approval of the subdivision. The ordinance has included this state-mandated provision in the proposed ordinance. SB 9 is silent as to whether or not the city can require owner occupancy of SB 9 units that do not involve an urban lot split in order to maintain consistency and to discourage absentee landlords and speculative development. The ordinance states that this same requirement to live on the property for 3 years from the date of approval be included for a 2-unit housing development. Several jurisdictions have included affordability requirements for SB 9 units in their implementation ordinances. These requirements have not yet been legally challenged, and the validity of affordable requirements for SB 9 units is unclear. As staff is reviewing housing affordability at a holistic level, both through the general plan update process and the inclusionary housing ordinance, which was initiated by City Council, affordability requirements have not been included in the draft ordinance. If determined to be appropriate or desired, such requirements could be reviewed in conjunction, again, with the inclusionary housing ordinance. To wrap up this section, the only manner in which the city may deny a proposed SB 9 subdivision or housing development is if the city's building official makes a written finding based on the preponderance of the evidence that the proposed project would have a specific adverse impact on public health and safety or the physical environment, for which there is no feasible method to mitigate or avoid that impact. It should be noted that this is a very high standard for municipalities to meet. Staff does recommend 2 amendments based on some public correspondence that we received. One is to clarify how protected trees, which absolutely must be removed, are to be mitigated. The language to be added is here in yellow. And to clarify that connection to all utilities is not required unless needed. In almost all cases, this will include all utilities mentioned, but in some cases, that may exclude gas. The proposed municipal code amendment is consistent with the goal and policy of the general plan shown here, because the city is using an appropriate tool of objective design standards and regulations to help ensure residential development allowed by SB 9 meets fundamental design principles and expectations for the city. By adopting this municipal code amendment to implement SB 9, the city is ensuring that local control is achieved to the best of the city's ability. Absent an ordinance regulating SB 9 projects, proposals for urban lot splits and 2-unit housing developments are only subject to the minimum standards outlined in state law. Without the implementation of local regulations specific to this type of development and subdivisions mandated by SB 9, the city is compelled to accept and approve requests to allow 2 single-family dwellings and/or allow subdivision of an existing property in a single-family residential zone under current applicable regulations without any of the local objective standards that are tailored, again, to this type of development. Staff recommends, again, that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council that they find this municipal code amendment is exempt from the provisions of CEQA and to approve the amendments described in the ordinance included in today's agenda packet. The next steps would include City Council review and final action. That concludes my presentation, and we are all here for questions.
Thank you very much for your report. Commissioners, are there questions of staff? Commissioner Buss? Commissioner Lanson?
You sure? Okay, I'd be glad to go through everything here. Ms. Kendall, thank you so much. I think this is one of the most sweeping changes in law that I've seen, by indicating that essentially there's no more single-family zoning throughout the state of California. And for us to kind of go through this is a bit overwhelming. So you did a fantastic job. You actually answered a lot of the questions I had. I do want to go through some kind of understanding of stuff to make sure that we're clear what we're doing, what we're not doing. First and foremost, I always ask, why are we here? My understanding is we have no choice but to implement the state regulations of SB 9, but what we're doing as part of this is going through a lot of objective standards to actually allow us to have some kind of control over the process. Would that be accurate?
Yes, the city does currently have to accept these projects which are allowed pursuant to SB 9. The ordinance before you this evening implements the state law and takes advantage of the flexibility baked into SB 9, which specifically allows a jurisdiction such as the city to implement standards that are, as long as they're objective.
In the second supplement we got today, one of our citizens, Ms. Sabella, is very concerned about SB 9, and it sounds like the implementation of it. She concerns about there's no requirement to inform neighbors of what's going on. She has 9 trash cans that are going to be mounting up. She is very upset. It's going to affect property values. Looking at this, it sounds like there's really nothing we can do to stop implementation of the things that she's most upset about. Would that be accurate? In terms of the SB 9 requirements that she's kind of frustrated about.
The city has to allow at least 2 units of 800 square feet each per lot, or up to 4 units on any original property boundary. The city cannot not allow that.
All right, so again, that's my concern, is that it sounds like we're really kind of strapped in terms of being handcuffed in terms of some of the issues she's concerned about, in terms of it has to be ministerial approved. It's not something we can actually require have public hearings as long as they satisfy these requirements. Is that correct?
Correct. Per state law, we may not hold a public hearing on any of these projects.
And one thing you made specific to point out, which I'm glad you did, is in terms of no more than 4 per lot. There's been a lot of talk with regard to people concerned about how that might end up having 10 units on the 2 different lots, and that's not going to happen according to this draft, correct?
Correct. At no time would you get more than 4 units per the original property boundary. If you split the lot, that would be 2 units per each of the newly created parcels.
Okay, so that tries to limit the impact. I remember in the ADU law, it came out, and within 6 months to 8 months, a new law came out trying to fix some of those provisions. Do you anticipate any kind of change in SB 9 that is coming down the pike, so to speak?
I don't believe there was any change to the SB 9 regulations in this year's housing package. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but as more people try to use this law and the kinks are, come to the surface, I wouldn't be surprised if we get amendments like we did with the ADU law.
And to that extent, are you aware of any current lawsuits that are going on with regard to challenging or addressing any of these issues that we should know about?
I can answer that question. Early on, there were a couple lawsuits that came down, but they haven't been successful in striking down SB 9.
And again, we can't delay. It sounds like we have to go through this process to implement the law, so we can't delay any further, notwithstanding whatever these claims may be. Would that be true?
Yeah, at this point, we're stuck, for lack of a better word, with SB 9, and so we need to process projects as we receive them based on existing state law. And this ordinance would just kind of enhance the existing state law and give the city some flexibility in, providing some local control.
My next question kind of relates to the general concept of objective standards, and that title gets thrown around. So I know as part of what you said, the other rule we did in Article 22, the objective standards there is a separate and distinct issue from this, correct?
Yes, those standards really didn't contemplate this type of development specifically, and so objective standards more specifically thought of for this type of development are included here.
And I know as part of the general plan update, we also looked at objective standards as part of that process, but that hasn't happened yet, so that's not something as part of this either, correct?
Correct.
So at some point, would these objective standards be incorporated within the housing element as part of the general plan update, is my assumption, if this were to pass?
I'll take that one.
I thought I'd try to get you into the conversation.
Well, thank you. Actually, the municipal code standards wouldn't actually be embedded within the housing element per se. You would have the policy direction to kind of follow through and amend the code as needed. Generally, you're doing that as a response to various state legislation. So if there was state legislation that said you need to update SB 9, just like ADU law, and we would have to address it. At this point in time, there wouldn't be a need to overhaul objective standards. I think as when I presented objective standards to this body and the city council, it was, basically our first attempt to address the law, and so that we had some clarity moving forward. It's not to say that, even in our own analysis moving forward and evaluating projects, do we go back as we look at the municipal code after the general plan? I mean, there will be that occurring, maybe not specifically for objective standards, but, for a variety of things. Clean up, creation of a mixed-use zone, those kind of things that were basically all initiated through the preferred land use map.
And while I have your attention, would these SB 9 units count towards our arena numbers?
Yes, they would. And I'll just take it a little bit further, just like ADUs, it wasn't until you could have a demonstrated track record that you could count them or project them out into the future. So we're probably going to have to wait a year or two at least to see, what is the production levels that we're receiving. We are required to report SB 9 units in our annual reporting to HCD. So they're going to be taking those numbers, and then probably as, we work on, in 8 years, for the next housing element, there'll be parameters for which we can, use those and project out what our average yield will be.
It's just unfortunate we're doing this at a time that I think the square footage price is $800 to $1,000 a square foot to try to build things there, but that's a different issue. You indicated there was one application that had already been submitted and I guess not approved, but submitted. Would that require any kind of retroactive evaluation of that application? I'm just trying to make sure that that person is not going to be subject to a different set of rules then.
The proposed ordinance would not apply to that application retroactively.
So it wouldn't be retroactive.
Correct.
Would it be applicable to the 30 or so people that either pulled papers or showed interest?
Well, it would be applicable to anybody that submits a complete application at the time that the ordinance is effective.
Again, you answered a lot of questions, so I'm kind of skipping through here. Now, I'm going to ask the obvious question here. That one of the exceptions, which is interesting because of how the state, and again, whenever you have a one-size-fits-all rule, I think you're going to end up finding this, is, as you kind of noted, that our entire area is a high fire danger zone area. Somebody would probably end up wanting me to ask the question, then why don't we take advantage of that and just say our entire city is exempt from SB 9 by virtue of being a higher fire zone? Can we do that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a kind of exceptions to the exception for high fire zones, right? And if you can establish building criteria to ameliorate the risks of the high fire zone, then you need to allow for the building. So you could build an SB 9 unit in a high fire zone as long as the building code has criteria in there to address those issues.
So we can, as a city, just basically kind of throw it through there. We'd have to actually make sure that it would apply these exceptions to the exception, is what you're saying.
Correct.
I thought we had an out there. I guess not. You indicated, though, speaking of exception, the ADUs had a HOA has to comply, but it sounds like what you're saying, this HOA doesn't have to actually let it and can still enforce its rules not to allow this.
Yeah, I mean, if you'll recall with the ADU law, initially there was no discussion about HOAs and their ability to prevent ADUs, and then subsequent legislation came in and said HOAs didn't have any authority to prevent them. At this time, with regard to SB 9 projects, SB 9 is silent as to the authority of HOAs. It's possible in the future that the legislature could come back and change that, but as we sit right now, HOAs can still apply and enforce their CC&Rs with regard to SB 9 projects.
And I noticed there was a requirement, a process, though, to make sure there was a notification to the HOA again, looking at trying to make sure that the city doesn't get embroiled in something, is there something where the city actually verifies whether it's subject to an HOA, or that the necessary applicable approvals have been given or not given, or do we get involved in that at all?
Well, we're not going to enforce an HOA CCNRs. The requirement in the application is for the applicant to provide the city with proof that they notified the HOA of the project. So once the HOA knows that there's a project, they can decide, what or if they will do anything about it.
In my day job, I'm a lawyer, and why don't we potentially add that more just in terms of notification, but make a representation that it's not subject to HOA rules, and to defend and indemnify us in the event that actually isn't accurate? Just as a thought.
So, Chair, if I may, if you go back to solar, right, when we talked about solar, initially solar also did not have that section that said an HOA could not control or prohibit solar on homes within a HOA or within the CCNRs. And of course, within a short time, that changed, and the law under solar law was that any contract that prohibited solar was now null and void, right? And then ADU law came around, and I remember saying in front of this body, it's silent because we had that question. And then I would say within 8 months or a year, as you noted, they added that section. I think with HOAs, this one might be a little bit different. I think they certainly are going to, there's a whole, obviously, purpose behind this, which is to get housing in, right? I mean, this is what they've been hitting with us, the Housing Crisis Act. I think we all have to understand that is the fundamental basis of which all these housing laws are coming at us, right? And more of our local control is being taken away. The purpose, again, that we stated tonight, is to ensure that we can have the flexibility that's permitted under this. The reason why we were careful with CCNRs is, as Mr. Doran noted, we do not enforce the CCNRs. We don't want to get into that battle between private parties with a contract. With that said, we thought at this point, to ensure that they gave us information that they notified the HOA, if they want to take action with them, they're going to be doing that. And it happens with solar sometimes where again, HOA cannot prohibit a solar on a property, but they can, as most of you know, they can say, as long as we're not reducing the amount of solar a house is going to have, for example, we can request that it's in a certain kind of form, right? As long as we're not prohibiting the solar to the extent that they needed it, to the power that they needed it. And so we have our own permit that we have to ministerially give. Again, remember, this is going to be ministerial applications. And so we can't have that delay where you have someone from a HOA body saying, hey, guess what? We have a problem here. So we're going to have a meeting in about 2 months, and we're going to let you know what we decide to do. And if we say they can't have it, you can't issue the permit. There's nothing in our law that says we can do that. So it's more about, hey, you might want to make sure you check with HOA. Did you check with your HOA? Yes, I did. That's how we're doing it.
It reminds me of the 5G time clock. I guess we have a very limited time period in which to do it.
Mr. Lanson, that is exactly right. It is small wireless facilities. We're doing exactly the same thing.
Okay, that does make sense. Coming back in terms of just the process, so in the event they submit their application and for whatever reason it doesn't get approved, what is their next step? Do they appeal it to this body? Do they have any other remedy? Is it just denied and that's it?
Right, it's either denied or approved, but again, to deny an SB9 project is pretty difficult to do. It's a pretty high standard for a building official to issue that denial with the specific findings that it's going to create a health and safety impact.
What if they wanted, and I think you kind of gave the implication, but I want to make sure, what if they want to put more than 4 units or whatever the number system is? That something where they can seek a variance before this body or some other way?
No, seeking a variance, there is nothing baked into the ordinance which would allow something like a waiver, but seeking a variance would throw them out of the parameters of SB9, and so they'd be out of the box.
And that would be subject to a far more discretionary process and evaluation that wouldn't be subject to SB9 then?
Correct.
Okay. All right. That makes it more clear. I'll go just through. I know I have other people wanting to talk here. Give me a second here. HOA. The last thing I'll actually ask about is the affordability. You indicated that the thought is to any affordability issue is incorporate with the inclusionary housing ordinance. I'll ask the obvious question. When is that potentially something that might come before us?
So we've currently enlisted the services of the consultant, and they are preparing a feasibility and Nexus study for the inclusionary housing. With that, they will be looking at a variety of building prototypes. Some include single-family homes, like a certain scale, as well as townhomes and multifamily type developments. Part of that will kind of set the parameters for what is feasible and what's legally defensible in terms of applying inclusionary housing. And it does need to be fair. And so there's two different processes that they go through. What is legally acceptable and then what is financially feasible. And at the end of the day, it's the second part that is going to be very critical in consideration on whether you can apply inclusionary housing to a project of 4 units. Typical inclusionary housing ordinances do not go that low.
We have to get to a definitional idea whether or not that can be extended in that way.
Yeah. That is something that, we, I think the studies will, can address, but it's typically not found in an inclusionary housing ordinance. It's not to say that, unlike ADUs, with our housing element that we just adopted, HCD wants to have cities promote incentives for ADU, homeowners who have ADUs to do affordable units, but right now for ADUs, it's not a requirement. So it kind of gets interesting because when you look at a 4-unit project, and if there's only 2 primary units and the other 2 are ADUs, how that inclusionary gets applied and whether it's even feasible.
Well, and for me, the practical reality, again, is we're dealing with a cost that is so astronomical, then to put that limit on there may actually serve the exact opposite of what the statute's trying to do, which is to create more housing. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The statutes are about creating more housing, but it doesn't necessarily have the teeth for affordability. So,
Thank you. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Commissioner McMahon.
Thank you. A lot of my questions were answered, so that's nice. I think it might be helpful for the public and myself. Could you distinguish between an ADU and a JADU for me?
Sure. A junior ADU has to be created within the envelope of the existing structure, or if it's a proposed structure, it has to be within the envelope of the primary dwelling unit. It cannot be more than 500 square feet, but it does have to include an efficiency kitchen. A regular ADU or full-sized ADU can be built attached as an addition or detached, and it has different size requirements.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. And then the short-term rental designation, is that on the deed for perpetuity?
Yes, any SB9 related project, urban lot split, or 2-unit housing development must, per the state law, record a deed restriction which states that all rentals must be 31 days or more.
Okay. Let's see. And are there any teeth? Is there any mechanical policy, or how is it going to be that there's the insurance that the owner will stay in that unit for 3 years? What is the mechanism for that?
It's a good question. So we're going to require that there be a deed restriction placed on the property that the city would be able to enforce. Certainly there's some difficulties with a short window of time, 3 years, and they're only required to intend to occupy the house for 3 years. So to be honest, enforcement's going to be a little bit difficult.
Okay. And then all this talk about the HOAs, what is to prevent them from having a meeting and adding to their CCNRs that we're not going to allow this, and, there's a lot of HOAs in our city. Is that something that might happen?
If I may, I think, as we discussed, certainly I would say currently there is no prohibition for HOAs to, under their CCNRs, to do exactly what you said, to adopt CCNRs that restrict or prohibit, I should say, SB9 units. I will just tell you that I think that you're going to see the reaction from the state, just like with the ADU law, in which if that happens, I think to a great extent, there's going to be probably a reaction from the state to modify that because of that underlying purpose about housing.
Okay, and I do think the rest of my questions were answered. Thank you.
Commissioner Link.
Thank you, Ms. Kendall, for your presentation. I'm sorry you drew the short straw, but and if you volunteered for this, kudos to you. But
I did.
you did. Wow. Congratulations. Quite the undertaking. My apologies also to the attorneys in the room because there are at least 3 that I count. And although I am a child of attorney and I'm going to try to put on my attorney hat, it's not going to go well. But anyway, so I'm going to dig into some semantics here, unfortunately, starting with demolition. So there is some terminology in here that I think potentially may need to be defined, but for the purposes of demolition, so we have 25% as the maximum, at least as the proposal for the ordinance. Who makes the determination of that percentage?
If needed, so we include in the ordinance a definition of demolition. And if it's not something that as staff I could make a determination, or if it's close, we would have the building official and a building plan check technician to make that determination.
Okay, and as far as the definition was concerned, it said structural wall. So this doesn't include sunrooms or a covered patio or anything like that as part of the definition, so that either the homeowner would be short-sheeted or maybe figured out a way. So does that include a garage, or is it just the habitable area of the house in terms of structural walls?
Yeah, we were just talking. It's defined as any portion of the structure.
Any
so as
portion
long
of
as
the structure.
headers are removed, there's main structural elements.
Okay. And I think the definition, or either that or the ordinance, specified that it was tenant, but it makes a determination between tenant, owner-occupied versus rented. So I assume that tenant just means that the building occupant, regardless of ownership.
Rental tenant.
Rental tenant. Okay. So then that begs the question, if the home is owner-occupied, can they tear the entire building down?
That is our current understanding.
Okay. Got it. Moving on to more or less access. So in the event that a lot split would occur more or less down the middle of the property, but the access driveway is not in that location, would the property owner, the person splitting the lot, then be required to relocate access so that it is continued to be shared, or would they be allowed to have 2 curb cuts?
The requirement that the access is shared is only for landlocked parcels,
So it's only for flag lots.
front and back. Mhm.
So potentially, if somebody were to split a lot down the middle, then we would lose a parking space.
That's correct.
And this might be a question for Mr. Fatemi, but do we have something in our code that requires that the spacing between driveways be such that a minimum spacing for a vehicle is maintained between new access points? I know we have it in SEMIA, I just don't know if we have it in Thousand Oaks.
You just wanted to get me down here. Huh?
I did, actually.
Actually, SB 9 has very little to do with public work requirements as far as the driveway location, driveway distances, the lot line, split regulations and reviews, tract map, parcel map, all those requirements stays the same. As that doesn't have any waiver or exclusion from any of our requirements for public works, basically.
So does our development code specify that a minimum length, either 18 feet or 20 feet, must be maintained between driveways so that we can have parking?
Correct.
Okay, excellent.
Either 5 foot between 2 driveways or 18 feet plus.
Excellent. And lastly, and I know that we have several developments in the city like this, but we have a lot of zero lot lines. So could potentially a person build a house within 4 feet of an existing dwelling on a zero lot line if the setback is for only minimum 4 feet?
I believe so, yes, as long as they meet the specific building code safety standards. I think the walls have to be fire rated to a certain degree, but yes. Short answer
So
is.
if the building code specifies that excavation within 4 feet of an existing dwelling could potentially undermine the foundation, then we could mandate a larger setback between building footprints. That'd be kind of health and safety-ish.
I would say that I think that's where you get into the situations in which we're going to contemplate saying no to a project because of that issue. But you have to really establish that through the factors because it's a preponderance of evidence of the city to deny that, and that goes to the public safety. So you really got to establish that that would be the undermining issue, as you mentioned. And so I think we would look at obviously on a case-by-case basis, but where you're going to be undermining some foundation of another residence, that probably would trigger
I would
public
hope so,
safety. Exactly.
but I'm not going to put it past anybody at this point.
I understand. I think it goes back to, as we said earlier, the state has made this a significant a change as far as the city's burden when it comes to saying no to these kind of projects, and so therefore taking an action like that would be something we would seriously consider and what the reasons are, and make sure we've documented those reasons, had those communications, have those factors, so we can say this is the reason why we're doing this, and we have obviously fire, building inspector backing us up because of those situations.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Commissioner Buzz.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very thorough. I had a bunch of questions coming in, and I really don't now. I just have a few for clarification. Number one for me was acting in concert. There is a slim but none possibility, but an existent possibility that family members could be living adjacent to each other and be doing these, making these efforts for an elderly parent or younger family members. Would that fall in that category, or is that an exception of some kind?
Yes. Yes, we would consider that to be acting in concert.
Okay, so that would be against the rules.
Right. A family member could not split their lot and then another family split the lot next to them.
You got it. So, okay, so if one family member splits a lot, then the person next to them is not allowed to do the same thing. Good to know. Okay. Then on the landlocked lots and flag lots and additional cutouts, I'm thinking of neighborhoods like, I forgot it again, that's amazing, Caneo Oaks, which doesn't have sidewalks. And so we don't have express cutouts as you would define them off of a sidewalk. We have a number of neighborhoods like that, but I'm just citing that example. Would that still apply if you created a landlocked lot there, that you want them to have the singular access, or would it be irrelevant because we're not technically cutting into sidewalks and stuff?
Yes, it would still apply in that case.
It would still apply. Also, the new law that was passed kind of eliminating parking rules in general for a number of things. Does that have any impact on this whatsoever? Because you mentioned that this is because of street parking.
So we can require one parking space per unit
On the property, but we're talking about street parking as a result of cutouts. So you can you require street parking as well?
No, we cannot require it. I think the purpose of doing the limitation on one curb cut on those landlocked parcel maps is so that you preserve the on-street parking, because if we are left only being able to apply one parking space per unit, then the thought process is that then parking will spill out onto the street, and therefore
I
we
agree
should
with you. I'm
preserve
just-
the amount of parking that's on the street. So that's the thought process we went.
Because as that person in the second letter mentioned, the number of trash cans that go out on trash day could be adversely impacted if every available parking space is full, every access cutout is full. What do we start doing in those situations? Is that, we're just going to kind of shake our hands at it and say that is what it is? Or are we going to start creating red zones within our residential neighborhoods? Is that something that we'd contemplate at this point?
Well, red zones would be typically associated with necessary fire requirements for spacing, so.
But this, I mean, trash is a health and safety issue. I'm literally just asking because I'm asking. This is a whole new world for all of us. We're reinventing suburbia here. And so it's just things I think about. So,
Well,
yeah.
Ideally, the trash would be out only once a week, and then it would be pulled back in. So
So it'd be
if
like
it's
a
not being
temporary-
pulled back in, that's, I think, I mean, if it's,
Would we designate
trash-
temporary no parking zones for that kind of stuff? Or would we just put people's trash cans out and hope that nobody runs them over? I mean, it could be kind of chaotic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we'd have to discuss with traffic, and, you know, there may be an option, if warranted, to limit parking on certain days, but I think that's something that we'd have to deal with on an, you know.
Well, I'm just asking
case-by-case
because we're
basis.
literally passing the rules here. I mean, we're going to start building these things.
If I may, this is not a new thing for us. If you go to part of North Ranch and Canal Oaks that you were talking about, it's the same situation exists. You're just going to have more cans. Right now, if you go, let's say, Golf Course Drive, you'll see the narrow streets
Yeah.
with no sidewalk and probably a dozen people with their dogs walking every day up and down.
Oh, I'm
And
familiar.
construction trucks parked on both sides. And trash days, all the trash cans are outside. Given that their frontage is much bigger, but with this situation, you're
Well,
going
that's
to
what I was going to
double
say, is
that.
obviously we're about to quintuple.
But
or
the parking is the
quadruple.
same issue. You know, the same parking areas we have in those streets going to be taken by the trash cans
Okay.
also. And normally, these trash cans come out either late at night before or early in the morning, and hopefully by afternoon, when people come back, they're back into their garages.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It'd be a one-day
And
thing.
that's what
but-
we're hoping for. But no, we don't have, actively, we don't have any regulations or anything that requires a specific location for trash cans or create no parking days during the trash pickup or red zones, as you mentioned, or limited red zones. We don't have any of that.
Okay.
So far, we didn't have any issues yet.
I guess we'll just cross that bridge when we come to it.
And we don't
It's an
expect
issue.
to have a lot of applications come through, but I think, I'm not sure if you're going to have a real problem with that.
Okay. Sounds good to me. All right, let's follow that up with, we were talking about the height allowances up to 25 feet, and then we were talking about demolition of walls. So I just want, for my own clarification, there's a large number of single-family ranch homes in Thousand Oaks. If somebody decided to go 2 stories, that's obviously permitted. Could you literally stack a second unit on, like a model match stack on top of a 1-story to make it 2 stories and call that your second unit on a non-divided property? You'd have to figure out the garage part, of course, but,
Sure, you could create a 2-unit housing development with one on the ground floor and one on the floor above.
okay. Yeah, I was just curious how that would work, because that would simplify a lot of those things, because I'm thinking about this landlocked lot and what would these actually look like in creation. So that would be the way to do it, the simplest way to do it, probably, for
Right.
people, because then you keep your land area, you know, your footprint's the same. It doesn't necessarily require demolition, that kind of thing. So that would make sense. Okay, I was just curious about that, if that was feasible. And then, just following up on the intent for the 3 years thing. So we're just confirming that in signing a letter of intent, we don't have an enforcement, it doesn't really have teeth, right? Or is there something in the state law that does have teeth?
So we're going to require that they sign an affidavit, and that's going to be recorded, that they're going to, that for the applicable projects, that they will stay in one of the units for 3 years.
And if
And
we
so
find
that will
out
be
that
enforceable.
18 months later, they rented out both of them, do they forfeit the rents on it? Is there a penalty of some kind?
Well, there's no specific penalty stated. I mean, it would be something that the city would have to initiate a lawsuit against them.
And then that would
And
be
then
determined by the courts.
Yeah, to enforce the covenant.
And you, at that point, would determine what you think the city's damages were for that and all that stuff, and ask for that? It'd be a civil matter?
It would be a civil matter.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that makes sense. All right, cool. And then if hypothetically somebody signed that letter of intent, they pass away, is that requirement extended to their heirs? If the property was transferred to, say, a survivor of some type?
So the covenant does indicate that it passes to the subsequent property owners, yes.
So then they would be required to reside in it even if they were like out of state hypothetically or something like that? Like what would the city be able to break that with them if that was required?
Would this, I don't understand, would the city be
Okay,
able to break
so
that?
say I live in Florida and my mother lives here, she signs this thing, promises to stay in it, she passes away after a year. I inherit the property from Florida, I have no intent of moving to Thousand Oaks. What's my recourse if my mother agreed to remain in the property? Would the property then remain vacant for 2 years while we wait it out? Or would we be able to remove that covenant for them? I ask because this is something that could happen.
Yeah, I mean,
Would there be a way to
the property
petition
is
that or
still
something?
subject to the restriction for the period of 3 years.
So then it would just sit vacant.
If I may, Commissioner Buss, because we have been debating this very issue in-house.
Oh, cool.
Because we look at,
it.
so it's, first couple of things. One is, I think it's important to note that we are literally complying with the state law as far as how we worded that requirement.
Yeah.
And we look at that word intend, and we say, okay, what does that mean, and how do we, as you said, how do we enforce it? What is that, could you have a situation where there was intent, of course, they signed the affidavit saying, I intend to do this, something happens, death,
Or somebody
new
gets a job transfer.
Exactly right.
Something bizarre, who
We're on the
knows?
same page.
Like people with good intentions.
Correct. And so what does that mean, right? And so this is another example of a SB 9 law and the housing laws, they're new. And we have no case law to help us figure out, okay, what happens when this particular fact pattern occurs? What happens when this particular fact pattern occurs? So this is where because of the newness, it's hard to answer a hypothetical because I think it's going to be, as Mr. Duran said, we might look at this as a civil matter. You signed an affidavit. What are the factors for your case? Obviously, with death, with someone saying, I intended to, but I'm moving, what does that mean? How can we enforce this? I think we're going to see some litigation happen over a very short period of time with these issues because of the concerns that we have with, okay, this is really not, there was fake intention, right? Yeah. Because the state didn't put any consequences into this bill to say, oh, if this happens, these are the steps the city can take against this person. It's not in there, right? Yeah. Now, I'm not going to get into the intent of the makers of this bill, right? Because they put that word in there, and I said, boy, you could have used a better word. You could have made this a little bit more restrictive, and they did not do that. They said intend, right? And they put that word in specifically, and that word has a specific meaning, right? Or a limitation of what does that really mean, right? It opens
I didn't
it
go
up.
to law school. I trust you on that.
Okay, I'm just telling you that that's a challenge that we have. And so I think it's important to remember that ultimately this law is going to have some kinks to it because it is very complex. It is very changing to our city planning.
Well, and
across
this
the
is the
board.
fascinating part for me because literally our city was designed for the exact opposite of this. So what we're asking to do is basically reinvent what our city looks like.
Right. And what we're asking you to do tonight is to say, here's the state law, here's the flexibility that we have that staff has been presenting to you to say, okay, these are the things that we have some control over. Here's why this is how we're going to do this. And this is our recommendation, because the state law is the state law, right? If we don't do anything, it's going to be, you don't have an ordinance on this. Okay, what are the state requirements? Boom, that's what you have.
Yeah, I mean, because, like when I was talking about trash, I mean, in an urban area, you've got an alley with dumpsters in it that everybody aggregately uses. I mean, literally, these are the things that don't exist in
that's another
suburbia.
example of not thinking the whole thing through, right, from the state. And so we're going to see maybe these changes that happen in the next couple of years where we have to have some modifications because of whatever happened, right? And some might be modifications to make it more restrictive, and some might be modifications to make it broader, like as we discussed, the HOA issue, right? I mean, you're going to see things change, but I think it's very important for staff, for the public to understand, for commissioners to understand that the basic premise, again, goes back to housing, right?
Yeah.
And this major push for the Housing Crisis Act to make these laws that continue to push. You mentioned the parking one. It's really not on the agenda tonight, but there was a question previously about the parking from, I think it's AB 2097. And again, we don't meet that definition for traffic stop, right? We don't meet that, but nevertheless, that's our initial take of it. We're going to see what happens as this gets interpreted and it gets applied. But to your point, it just is like, this is another thing being thrown at us that's very quick. It's so impactful. And if it does impact our cities, in some way, we need to be aware of that, and that's what we're trying to do.
You got it. All right, thank you. And that was my last question. And with that, I just want to throw out to especially you for taking up this challenge, trying to re-envision what a city looks like or a suburb looks like when it's no longer the suburb as it was originally designed is amazing. And thank you so much for your time for doing it.
Commissioner McMahon.
Thank you. I don't mean to dwell on this 3 years, but I have one more question. The wording is the intent for minimum of 3 years from the date of approval. If that's the date of approval for the project and the project takes a year, do they only have to live in there for 2 years, or does this mean to be the certificate of occupancy?
Correct. They have to have a habitable dwelling unit on the property before the subdivision would be approved. So the approval for the subdivision would be held back until that's possible.
And that's when the 3 years starts.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
Ms. Kendall, I also want to add my thanks. This is a very complex law. It's a very new law, and I appreciate your thoroughness in explaining it to us in terms we can understand. So thank you for that. I want to go back to a point Commissioner Lanson alluded to at the beginning of his questions. It's really a why are we here question. Commissioner Lanson suggested a kind of inevitability about this hearing and suggested we really have no choice, almost that we have to do this. I'm going to ask the opposite question, which is, what is the consequence to the city if we do not act on this, or if we recommend not to adopt the changes or amendments that you've walked us through this evening?
So I think the consequences of not adopting such an ordinance is that you will be stuck processing these projects just based on SB 9. And so you wouldn't have any of the conditions or objective standards that we're talking about today.
There is relevant city law today governing many of the things that we've talked about, and there is SB 9. There are areas where they're in conflict, for example, regarding setbacks or our tree ordinances or other things. If we recommended not to act on this, and there are two sets of laws that are in conflict, which one takes precedence?
The state law.
All right, thank you. Mr. Duran mentioned, you said there had been a couple of lawsuits, none successful so far. Are you aware of, this is a question about the legal landscape around SB 9 right now. Are you aware of other legal challenges that exist now? Are you aware that the League of California Cities, of which our city is a member, is it contemplating bringing a legal challenge? Or are there other challenges now in process?
I'm not aware of the league initiating a legal challenge to SB 9 now.
All right.
If I may, Chair, I will also say I'm not aware of the league in any way challenging this. I will say that before this SB 9 was adopted, we do have a legislative liaison, Mina Leva, who looks through all the bills that are upcoming, and this one was something that was sort of presented a while back and didn't get enough legs to move forward, and then we have this one. But we certainly opposed, the city certainly opposed this legislation, and I know a number of cities did, of course. There might have been some minor compromises with some of the public agencies over a period of time that might have changed a little bit of the drafting, but ultimately the big impact that we still have is certainly state-driven. The only, again, I want to, I'm overemphasizing this point, but I think it's on purpose, is SB 9 is the law. What we're presenting to you today is a way for us to modify the law to some benefit where we have a little bit more control, we have standards that we can apply, and we can have the ability in some cases to say no to a project because they don't meet certain standards. And if we don't have that, then we're going to even lose our ability, or at least it's going to be much more of a challenge to fight these situations or these projects, certainly because we don't have anything to stand behind to say, oh, you're violating the ordinance, section 9-3.425, whatever it is. So that's where we got to be, I really want to emphasize that we are trying to do the best with what we have, and then use this ordinance to help direct the best of the SB 9 projects that we can possibly get. I think that's the best way to say it.
And I appreciate that effort on your part and on all of your parts. Has the city done any sort of impact analysis on the outcome of SB 9 as we understand it? Is it going to quadruple the number of rentals? Is it going to have a meaningful impact on our affordability picture? Has there been any sort of analysis around whether the law will do what its intention is?
Chair Newman, I think it's a little bit too early to say at this point in time. The ability to do SB 9 has been untested. There's a lot of kind of barriers to entry. I mean, it is in a lot of cases, an expensive proposition for a property owner to kind of pursue. Also, in terms of, affordability, I mean, the law is actually silent in terms of affordability. It's just, and this is kind of with a lot of the legislation, it's just about numbers, creating the housing stock. So, in terms of its intent of meeting affordability, the bill isn't clear in that regard. So,
right. I mean, to your point with ADUs, where per the annual report that you prepared for the city council, where 80% of all the building permits the city issued last year were for ADUs, and 100% of those were in the above moderate category, so not affordable housing.
correct. I mean, because, as far as how you can demonstrate their affordability, they've been kind of characterized as affordable, but that's more of just
That was the sales
in
pitch,
economies
yeah.
of scale. But,
Yes.
in terms of the technical requirements as far as reporting to HCD, that's a different matter.
Right. All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'd also add there that it is, I think, informative or indicative, since this law's been in effect for 9 months, we've only had one application that met the criteria where we had 30 inquiries, and staff's been talking to those 30 different people. None of them either met the criteria or could afford to do it once they found out what happened to happen.
Oh, I see. So it's not then the case that the 30 applications are merely in process. It's that these were more like inquiries, and
Right, they were
some found
inquiries
out
and they just decided not to move forward.
they didn't proceed or were not eligible
And I think
or
you can
whatever.
see from the presentation tonight, there are a lot of high thresholds here, a lot of cost, $500 to $1,000 a square foot to build one of these.
Right. So that might, and it's just the evidence suggests so far in the 9 months that this has been law, that it's the very complexity of the law itself and the number of requirements is a brake on the rate at which this type of housing might be produced. Is that a fair understanding of what we've seen so far?
Certainly one of the interpretations you could make from it.
Right, okay.
And Chair, I would also say that with with ADU, you mentioned ADUs, right? And if you've noticed, I'm sure all of you have noticed now that there are almost like ADU specialists now that have been,
Right.
they know there was a market for this, and so they're saying, here's our design, we have the design for you, we have the process for you, we'll work with the city for you, and the world will be the consultant for you, and we'll get, for a fee, of course, but you see that developing more now throughout California, and I think as time goes on with SB 9 projects, maybe it goes that way. I think there is certainly a different threshold for cost because, as Ms. Kendall noted, you will, if you split the lot, for example, you're paying those fees. If you have a primary residence, you have to pay for those fees. There's connection fees. All those factors come into play where you say, okay, here's the value of my house. I want to add another house. Wow, that's a big number I got to deal with for your purpose, right? Versus an ADU, smaller, you're in control over it still, a little bit less costly.
Thank you for that. I'd wonder if staff wishes to address a question raised in our supplemental packet by Mr. Friedman regarding the lack of architectural control. If there is, in many aspects, only ministerial approval allowed, and his point, this is question number 4 he's asking, his point is that that includes automatic or ministerial approval of architectural details. If the city cannot make judgments about architecture, how does that work logistically? Is an applicant just submitting, as Mr. Friedman suggests, just a 3D cube that shows compliance with the setback requirements and that's it?
No, an applicant would still need to submit a full set of plans as they would, just like for an ADU, that shows the height, what it's going to look like. And there are some standards in here, for example, the privacy glass, if you're within 10 feet of an adjacent dwelling unit, your windows have to be fitted with privacy glass. So we would need to see where those windows are. We also need to see things like floor plans to make sure that it qualifies as a dwelling unit and things like that. So I think it's a misrepresentation to say that the city does not have any architectural control. All of those architectural standards are in the ordinance as drafted.
In the past, the city, speaking on architectural control, has required applicants who come in with structures that have significant massing to put some sort of articulation on a big facade, for example. Does the city still have that degree of control with SB 9 properties or not?
Not currently as the ordinance is written. We did not apply, and if you recall, as part of the Article 22 objective standards, there were things in terms of articulation of wall planes and so forth, but that was primarily written for much larger structures, wall planes exceeding 30 or 50 feet. So at this point in time, there isn't anything in the ordinance. However, if that's something that we need to address in the future as we come up with those, it certainly is something that could be amended as part of the code if this were to be adopted. So
the city does retain the power to have that degree of architectural review with SB 9?
Not as written, though.
Not currently, I understand.
But currently, but it could adopt, we could get more rigid architectural standards that are objective. Probably have to stay away from style, things like that, but in terms of wall articulations, roof pitches, maybe there's a certain gradient of how well it matches the form of the primary unit. All those kind of parameters could be explored and introduced.
All right. Some more points, just so I understand what is and isn't permitted under SB 9. The grading standards, if I understand correctly, as is the case today, grading of slopes of 25% or greater is not permitted unless Planning Commission grants a waiver. Do I understand correctly that a waiver would not be required provided a lot would support two houses of at least 800 square feet apiece? Is that correct?
So grading on areas that are 25% steeper or more steep would be prohibited unless that precludes you from getting those 2 units of 800 square foot each. So if your whole property is steep, then you would only be allowed to fit those 2 units in the minimum amount of land disturbance feasible. Does that make sense? So you could only grade on 25% slopes or steeper to the degree in which it allows you to get those 2 units.
I thought that, well, just for clarification, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, but I also thought that was the current standard. We use this, we allow a waiver when there's no other way to let the property owner make reasonable and conformant use of their property. That's the case today. So what changes here? Just the fact that it's 2 structures and they're 800 square feet or greater?
Yes, that's the minimum that the city has to allow.
Right, and that would be allowed without waivers, without public review, without public comment.
Correct.
I see. So I'm not saying anything specific about an upcoming hearing. We owe the future applicant a fair hearing, but there is an upcoming hearing for a project that is significantly larger than 800 square feet. If that lot could accommodate that significantly larger house and another structure of 801 square feet, and it were on a very steep slope, we would not have a hearing about grading, correct? Because there's enough land to accommodate both a very large house and another house that's 800 square feet.
I'm not sure I'm understanding exactly the scenario you're describing.
I
but,
apologize for not asking clearly.
But for example,
if there's a 6,000 square foot house and an 801 square foot house, and they're on a piece of land that can accommodate them both, but is on a very steep slope, do I understand correctly that there would be no hearing to grant a waiver for that grading?
if the other existing house is 6,000 square feet, that could feasibly be converted into including that minimum level of development. And so, no, we would not allow additional grading on steep slopes in that case, because their property is not precluded from getting that development if they were to convert their existing structure.
I see. Okay.
Basically, Chair, they would have to exhaust all their design options in looking at setbacks, open space requirements, the grading, and even our tree ordinance requirements. I mean, all those things have to be evaluated to determine whether if all those rules preclude the ability of 800 square feet a unit per unit that's allowed.
So it's a sort of last resort approach, saying, right. I see. Speaking of tree ordinances, do I understand correctly that the replacement of trees in SB 9 eligible properties, 1 is ministerial? Is that correct?
Yes, and let me just recap what's included in the
Please.
ordinance, because I deleted that slide inadvertently. So the removal of protected trees is prohibited, just like the grading standard, unless that precludes you from getting that minimum level of development.
I see.
So if you have to, as a last resort, remove that protected tree, you are required to replace it on site with 1 oak tree per the recommendations of the city arborist.
Why is it a 1-to-1 replacement instead of 3-to-1 as we use with other tree cases?
I believe the residential standard is normally 2 to 1. Please, somebody correct me if that's incorrect.
Okay, but it's greater than,
incorrect.
you're correct, actually, but it is greater than 1 to 1.
If I recall, when we had this conversation, it was more so related to if you had a property where that was your last resort and you were precluded from this minimum level of development and you had to remove a tree or trees, you probably don't have a lot of space on your property to then plant new trees. And the preference being the replacement on site rather than off site, we kept it to
We
this
have
level.
cases like that today, though, and we still keep the 2 to 1 requirement and just say the other one must be off-site. But if I understand correctly, we're lowering the standard to just say, no, it's a 1 to 1 replacement. Is my understanding correct with SB 9?
That's how the ordinance is drafted as it is right now, but that's something that could be.
So it is, I mean, this is a case where there are fewer replacement trees than what we have today.
I would need to double check the oak tree guidelines, which I can do.
Okay. And then the final question I have is regarding CEQA review. Do I understand correctly that SB 9 properties are just automatically CEQA exempt? Is that a correct understanding of the rule?
Correct. As ministerial projects, they don't qualify for CEQA review.
Okay. All right, thanks very much. Commissioners, are there other questions of staff? Okay, then, I think our next step is to turn to public comment. And we have 3 speakers, all of whom are joining us remotely. And because it's 3 speakers, they will each have 5 minutes. And we ask that you each state your name and your city of residence for the record. And we will begin with Jackson Piper, followed by Marianne Van Zyl, and then Clint Foltz. Mr. Piper, are you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can. Good evening.
Great. Good evening. My name is Jackson Piper. I live in unincorporated Newbury Park. And I'm here, sorry if I missed anything, please let me know and I'll include that. But I'm here to support the implementation of SB 9 by the city. Not only because it's a statewide law, but because I think it will be beneficial to prospective residents of the city and even to the existing residents of the city to have more flexibility in what our zoning allows. We definitely need more housing. We don't only need single-family housing increases, but we can definitely use more. And this will give some incentive for people to, in my belief, make better use of their properties than just having a large yard and maybe a house that's oversized for their current needs. I'm hoping that there's some way the city can incentivize some affordability in the case of lot splits, and maybe find some way to make the production of units at affordable levels more attractive to property owners. Just looking through the Ventura County income limits that were put out by the state for this year, minimum level of payment of $2,885 per month for the upper end of the upper end of the low income level. For 20 years would result in $692,400 over that 20 years going to the property owner, which sounds like a lot, but then if you consider the cost of the construction of the unit, it doesn't seem like they'll be doing much more than breaking even, if at that. So there's got to be some way to allow for lower income families and even moderate income families that are otherwise blocked from accessing housing in Thousand Oaks to be able to afford some of these units. And I very much hope that the city can find a way to do that. Other than that, I'm very pleased with the staff's recommendations, and I urge you all to endorse what they've presented here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on, we hear next from Marianne Van Zyl and then Clint Foltz. Ms. Van Zyl, good evening.
Good evening, Chair Newman, and good evening to the rest of our planning commissioners. I too am in favor of your acceptance of this proposed implementation of SB 9. One of the things that I am not certain about, and I'm not certain that it was described correctly, was that the city may adopt regulations which allow, this is on page 13, the bottom of 13 or the bottom of 12, the city may adopt regulations which allow for greater than 25% demolition of the existing units as long as they have not been occupied by a tenant for the last 3 years. However, staff has not included any such provision in the proposed ordinance. Although staff has not recommended allowing greater demolition than the state-mandated minimum, a more flexible standard may encourage conversion of existing single-family homes into duplex rather than development of multiple detached units. I hope that the city will adopt a more flexible demolition standard. In various points in my life, I have lived in duplexes, and I have been very happy living in a duplex. It does not change the character of a single family neighborhood. There are many older suburbs, not quite so much like Thousand Oaks used to be an exurb, and now it is a suburb. Closer in suburbs have duplexes mixed in with single family homes, and the neighborhoods have charming character. I think this is important I think this entire process is important to densify areas of the city. And as we think about creating incentives for people to move through this process more quickly or with lowered fees, I hope the city would consider incentives for people making this type of conversion within a half mile of our neighborhood shopping centers. The city could use density in these areas to promote active transportation, bicycling and walking, to remove reliance on cars. If we actually had protected bike lanes between these pods within the city, these perhaps densified pods within the city, it would bring a great benefit to citizens and the city and our environment alike. So I hope that's another thing that the city will consider. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before you go, if I may follow up with a question on these incentives for property owners within a half mile of shopping areas, are you thinking of density bonuses or something? What sort of incentives are you recommending here?
Per this regulation, it doesn't appear that a density bonus is allowed, and I'm okay with that. Perhaps there could be a height exception, although I don't know that. Well, that actually might be nice in some areas where the lots are relatively small, but I was thinking more in terms of reduced permitting fees for various parts of permits, that there might be a reduction in permit fees and perhaps a raise of the height allowance. That's what I had in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Clint Foltz. Good evening.
Hello, my name is Clint Foltz, and I'm a resident of Thousand Oaks. I'm not speaking tonight on behalf of any organization, and the views expressed herein will be my own. For far too long, cities in the U.S. have made building climate-friendly housing difficult and often impossible. Zoning laws that were explicitly designed to segregate Black, Indigenous, and people of color from white suburban neighborhoods have helped to fuel the housing crisis as well as the climate crisis. We need to move past luxury zoning, also known as single-family residential zoning, towards more inclusive, climate-aware housing, and SB 9 is a small step in that direction. Much of the U.S. is currently saddled with car-centric suburban sprawl, and increasingly large houses, often built in the wilderness-urban interface. But building denser, environmentally friendly ADUs, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes in luxury zoning areas have been illegal, a vestige of de jure segregation. Here in Thousand Oaks, we have overcrowding and homelessness, in part due to a lack of housing, while a whopping 64% of our community's greenhouse gases come from vehicle use. Science tells us that electric vehicles alone will not reduce our greenhouse gas emissions fast enough to keep us under the recommended safe level of global heating. We need to create denser, walkable cities with reliable public transportation. Luxury zoning prevents us from doing that. I believe housing is a human right. So far, local control has failed to provide enough housing and has only perpetuated inequality along racial and class divides. What if we left abortion rights, civil rights, or LGBTQ+ rights to local control? What sort of society would we have now? And CEQA is good, but it is often misused by bad actors to prevent climate-friendly infill housing. We need more infill housing and not more sprawl into farmland, open space, and the wilderness-urban interface. We need to create a just, human-centric, fossil fuel-free city, and denser infill housing will help do that. I agree with city staff and ask that SB 9 and amendments be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you. We go now back to staff for any follow-up comments.
Let me first address the oak tree issue. So
Thank you.
the current requirement is the 3-to-1 replacement for new construction in residential areas. However, in cases where houses currently exist, the requirement for replacement shall be one 36-inch box oak tree for every healthy oak tree approved for removal. So that is what we were mimicking in the proposed ordinance.
So it's matching the current rule for new construction.
For where houses currently exist.
I'm sorry, for existing houses.
Right,
Okay. And then 3-to-1 for new construction.
right, like a new subdivision.
Okay. So it's matching what we currently have for. Great.
Right.
All right. Thanks.
And then I believe one of the speakers mentioned some confusion around the demolition, and I'm not sure I heard her comment all the way through correctly, but and I don't have the staff report in front of me, but there has been some clarification of the demolition allowed, and so if somebody needs me to repeat that, please let me know. Okay.
Commissioners are motioning
One more time.
in.
So if the question is, could I partially or completely demolish an existing dwelling for my SB 9 project? The answer would be an applicant may not propose a project which requires the demolition or alteration of housing that is rent controlled, subject to affordable housing restrictions, removed from the rental market via the Ellis Act in the last 15 years, or has been occupied by a rental tenant in the last 3 years. So you may not propose a project which requires demolition of any of those units. If a dwelling unit on the site has been rented in the past 3 years, no demolition of that unit which has been rented is allowed. If there are other units which were not rented on the same site, demolition of up to 25% of the existing exterior walls of the non-rental unit is allowed per SB 9, unless the city allows more via local ordinance, which could incentivize conversions or attached construction, which I believe is what the speaker was mentioning. If no dwelling unit on the site has been rented in the last 3 years, the entire structure may be demolished.
Or any portion thereof to accommodate a duplex or some other modification.
Mhm. Are there any other comments or follow-ups?
So sorry. That, I think, is it.
Okay, great. I had a couple of terminology questions. I know Commissioner Link had asked about terminology before. Are the concepts of A, single-family dwelling, and B, what is a renter? Are they any different in SB 9 than they are in our existing law? In the municipal codes? Understanding of the terms. Has that changed at all?
No, I don't think so.
All right. Commissioner Lanson.
Thank you, Chair Newman. I just had one follow-up. And it was mentioned briefly, but I want to make sure that we also clarify that the new law that was passed, AB 2097, which was supposed to provide various limitations on what local governments can do with regard to requiring parking within certain transportation hubs. I think I'd ask the question, is that applicable to the city of Thousand Oaks?
No. We've had our public works people look at that, and we don't meet any of the criteria that would designate a transit stop that would meet that criteria. So no.
So that law would not be applicable, but SB 9 is something, it's applicable to every city throughout the entire state, so we have to enforce that, right?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Commissioners, are there any other questions of staff? Very good. Well, again, our thanks. This is a complex topic, and I appreciate how adroitly you walked us through it. Thank you. I will go ahead and close the public hearing and open up the floor for discussion and/or a motion. Don't all speak up at once. Commissioner Buss.
All right, I will start with the, where's the motion at here? Sorry, I should have been prepared. I would like to go ahead and move that we find that the municipal amendment is exempt from the provisions of the California Environmental Quality Act pursuant to California Government Code Sections 65852.21J and 66411.7N, as in Nancy, and approve amendments to the Thousand Oaks Municipal Code as described in Attachment 2. Subject to the editorial modifications we made earlier. Thank you. I do want to add a brief editorial comment about this. As was mentioned, I believe 31 parties reached out to the city after this was passed, and only one of them found that it was financially feasible for them and made sense. I do not believe that Prop 9 is going to solve our local housing issue. I do not believe it's going to increase affordability. I do have a few ideas for the state if anybody's listening from the state. Number one, they need to incentivize the missing middle housing that's not being built right now. Condos, co-ops, townhouses, all of those things. The state representatives may or may not be aware it's nearly impossible for builders to get insurance on those things right now due to the way many of them were sued out of existence by HOAs and the way that our laws are set up currently. So if the state would like to go into the insurance business, that would be awesome. I'd really appreciate that. Maybe they can refloat the people that need to build these things. This would help out first-time buyers, people like me when I was 23 years old and bought my first condo, 1,100 square feet in Thousand Oaks. And it's the reason that I was able to stay here for 25 years. So I think a lot about the generation coming up, and they can't do that now. The other thing is that I'd like the state and also federal representatives consider is perhaps expanding access to loans. Once upon a time, we established the FHA, and that did a huge service to a lot of people that couldn't afford to buy. And we need to rethink how that works for the generation coming up today when they're looking in the face of hundreds of thousands of dollars on top of the hundreds of thousands in student loans they have. Appreciate everybody's patience on that, and I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Commissioner Buss, for your comments. Commissioner Lanson.
Thank you, Chair Newman, and thank you, Commissioner Buss. By the way, I have a thought with regard to the estate planning question we had and the fact of the 3 years. There's this thing called Prop 19 that was passed that ultimately requires somebody to actually move into the property in order to maintain the property value, subject to not being reassessed. So that probably will motivate them to either live there or sell it. So maybe indirectly there might be actually a way that issue may get resolved. But anyway, putting that aside, as I'm going through this is a massive law. Ms. Kendall and the entire staff, you guys did a fantastic job of putting it together. I've been reading it for months now, trying to kind of understand all the different tendrils that kind of goes into this process. So thank you very much for going through that. In looking at this, and I know there's lots of frustrations about things changing, and I realized I'm as old as the city. I was born in 1964, which was when the city was adopted. And and when the plan was set forth, yeah, a long time ago, when the plan was set forth, our city had a certain way of looking at a certain plan, and that general plan was done 50 years ago. And we've successfully satisfied that plan. Now, again, because of various reasons, we need to modify that. And again, I think Commissioner Buss said it, we need to re-envision the city in various aspects. I appreciate what the state's trying to do with regard to this process. I personally feel that our efforts with regard to the general plan update that we did have been far more and will be far more effective in terms of trying to actually help our citizens than what I deem to be a one-size-fits-all law that at the end of the day isn't really going to be, it's more theoretical, I think, unfortunately, and especially right now because of the cost that goes into things. So I very much, and again, I know there's lots of people that get frustrated at local control and flexibility. I think that's really the best way of getting things accomplished. And in my opinion, looking at this, what the staff has put together is we have the requirements of SB 9, but all of the other incidents and the flexibility and the general and objective standards, that to me is the meat and potatoes of how we can actually help our citizens. So I'm very much in favor of the concept. And by the way, again, Ms. Van Zyl, I agree with you that there's some situations here that may not have gone enough. But to me, this is a huge change. We have gone from essentially the state is required. There is no more single-family zoning in the state of California. That is absolutely huge. And to require any local municipality kind of adopt those issues, I think that is in and of itself a huge monumental task. So yes, we're going to do things probably incrementally, I think, in some of the aspects. And again, as we've been talking about, there's certain things that we're going to wait and see a little bit as to how HOA maybe issues work out or how some of the demolition issues maybe work out. So again, hopefully there's that patience of saying we always can come back and revise this if it's necessary. But with that, I will say I'm in favor of it and I support the motion.
Thank you. Commissioner McMahon?
I will support the motion. I think a lot has been said about, I don't think it's going to change our city that much. I think it's just too difficult to build here. I think it's going to be very expensive. But if somebody wants to do it, it would help out with housing. And what we don't want to see is every third lot to be built like this. So maybe the cost prohibitiveness of it, oh brother, that was a bad word, but the costliness of it will maybe keep it tamed and not so dense for our city, and yet still allow for an additional amount of housing. So like I said, I will approve this one.
Commissioner Link?
Thank you, Chair. If nothing more than to maintain local control, I will wholeheartedly support the ordinance as been presented by staff and all the dubious, or not dubious, that's the wrong word, good God. Extensive. There's a word that begins with D, and I've completely lost it. But anyway, no, extensive research, not dubious. That was a Freudian slip. Dubious is with what regard I think that this bill came from, which I think wants to be everything for everybody. When we take a lot and split down to 1,200 square feet, that makes sense in a place like Santa Monica, but it doesn't necessarily make sense in a place like Thousand Oaks. And I think one of the things that sort of gets stuffed under the rug and doesn't quite out is that when you make these kind of modifications, and near as I can tell from SB 9 and the various other bills, your property taxes will adjust their basis with these kind of improvements. So if you're used to spending $2,000 a year on property taxes and you go ahead and improve and split your lot, expect to be paying $1 million or more in property taxes as it adjusts to market value. So keep that in mind as you go forward with these things. And I see that the state is very well intentioned with respect to adding housing units, but it just, affordability, I think, is not quite there. So again, so to help us maintain the local control and the objective standards that this ordinance establishes, I will go ahead and support this.
Thank you. I want to talk for a moment more about the intentions that Commissioner Link mentioned. And at a 50,000-foot level, I agree with the intentions of SB 9. As staff has reminded us every year, our greatest unmet need by far is to produce, call it entry-level housing, call it housing people can afford. The group of people in our city who are families that making between roughly $63,000 and $100,000 per year have a serious unmet need for housing. And I appreciate the efforts of state legislatures to try to mandate the creation of that housing statewide. I agree with the pejorative characterization of this being a one-size-fits-all approach. What may be appropriate in San Jose or in San Francisco with, for example, 4-foot setbacks everywhere might not make sense in places like ours where there's more space, but we're mandating the same thing statewide. Further, I'm extremely skeptical that the mandates, the many mandates in this law, will accomplish the good intent of making housing, of bringing costs down and making housing more affordable or more within reach of that 63K to 100K group. More density by itself does not enhance affordability. It just creates more density. And so I agree with our public commenters who are saying what we really need is more incentives to create that affordability. We're not doing a thing about affordability tonight. I'm going to support Commissioner Buss's motion because the alternatives here are, the question before us here tonight is, do we flout state law, which is an option, we can do nothing, but as Mr. Duran has pointed out, we have less control then, not more, because the state law and only the state law would be the governing, would govern our housing policy here. Or do we take a greatly reduced amount of control, but still some control, not zero? Which of those two is better? Well, neither is good, but the latter is clearly preferable. And the final thing I'll say against SB 9, well, again, I do like the idea of addressing our housing affordability problem. The final thing that is really problematic for me is that it removes public notice and public hearings. And these are bedrock elements of any democracy, of any good government. Sunshine is a really good disinfectant, and it needs to be an essential part of government at all levels. And the state is taking that away from us. I agree with the state's intent here. I think the way they're doing it is in some ways is good because it is creating some of the housing we need, but in other ways it's really bad and really counterproductive. So if I'm able to pick and choose which parts of this I'm voting for, that is definitely not one of them. But I will vote for the good efforts that staff has made. And I'll wrap up my comments by echoing Commissioner Lanson's notice that we've had planning here for 50 years. I would characterize it as very good planning. The reason that Thousand Oaks is so desirable, the reason that so many people want to live here is in part because of the efforts that you've made and your predecessors have made for decades. But that requires you having the tools you need to do your job. And I join the others in preferring that we have good control of those tools and that we produce housing using those tools to produce housing for all residents at all levels. So with that, I'll support the motion. And I'll ask the clerk to prepare us for a vote.
Commissioner Buss?
Aye.
Commissioner Lanson?
Aye.
Commissioner Ling?
Yes.
Commissioner McMahon?
Yes.
Chair Newman?
Aye.
Motion carries 5-0.
Again, thanks to staff for all their hard work on this project. We don't have any, this is not an appealable hearing, so there's no appeal period that applies. There's no department reports tonight. We move next to commission comments and AB 1234 reports. Are there any comments from my fellow commissioners? Commissioner Buss.
I just wanted to thank the Thousand Oaks Police Department, Chief Paris, and Sergeant Patterson. This week, there'll be a pedestrian safety enforcement operations plan throughout the city, and I, as a person who walks my children to school every morning, am extremely grateful for the efforts they're putting in to make sure that my kids are safe. Thank you.
Thank you for that important public safety announcement. Commissioner Lanson.
Thank you, Chair Newman. I would say to everybody, of the many things that are going to be on the ballot this year is what we just got through talking about, which is the general plan update as part of voting for your city council. So please go get registered to vote. It's important to be part of that process. Again, we just talk about the community we have. Be part of that community. Get out there and vote. And again, understand that general plan is on the ballot with regard to whoever it is you ultimately want to support.
Thank you. Commissioner Link, comments? Very good. All right, then we move to staff update. Mr. Dugan, are there any follow-up items, announcements, or upcoming issues?
Mr. Chairman, there's several. On September 27th, the City Council meeting tomorrow evening, there'll be a consent calendar item for environmental consulting services for the Los Robles Cancer Treatment Center project as proposed. And on October 11th, we'll have a public hearing on SB 9 at the council, and the item will be that was heard this evening. And there'll be a department report on the many mansions Bella Vista refinance proposal. And in upcoming Planning Commission schedule, on October 10th, the Planning Commission will have a public hearing regarding the municipal code amendment related to self-storage. And on October 24th, there'll be a public hearing regarding a new single-family detached dwelling at 2546 Oak Shore Drive. That concludes my report.
And that concludes our meeting. Thank you all. We are now adjourned to our next meeting, October 10th, 2022 at 6 p.m. Good evening, Thousand Oaks.